there are lots of people now like me saying, look, we did obey, we will pretty much obey the first series of lockdowns. But we've reached a point now, nearly 2 years on, where we just can't go on living like this, where life has to go on. And I think if they did try to go for a full lockdown, I think the millions that would simply stick two fingers up and say, we're not doing this, is enormous. So this is not an easy position for the government. What I do expect to see are more restrictions. I'd be very surprised if nightclubs were still open in 6 or 8 weeks' time. I'd be very surprised if some form of vaccine passport didn't start to get demanded more regularly. By the way, if I'm going to a football match, I don't mind having a test that morning to prove that I'm negative, but I do mind having to carry a vaccine passport when I walk into a pub. I will not do that. And I think there's a lot of people feel like me. So it's a tough one. I think my prediction, Nick, is...
Hello and welcome to This Week in Review with Nigel Farage. Nigel, the supply chain crisis that has engulfed the world has struck the Farage household. You have some interesting news.
Yeah, well, I'm going to pick up a new car today, but I was expecting it about a month ago. But there's a shortage of so many components that even when you want to go and spend money, it's quite a difficult thing to do. And of course, we've got this sort of legacy debate. Oh, well, it's all because of Brexit, but it's actually happening right across the Western world. And really, Nick, it's what you and I have been talking about now for months. It's a massive increase in the money supply, chasing the same number of goods. It's classic 70s style, rising prices and shortages. And I have to say, there's no sign that I can see of this going away between now and Christmas. If anything, I think it's probably going to worsen.
Yeah, one of your readers explained to me how this works in terms of the inflation causing the inventory shortage and the supply chain disruption. And a big part of it is that by the time the goods are sold, the price of acquiring new inventory is so much higher that people aren't making any money on the sale, and it causes this reverse effect, this reverse domino effect. Let's move on to the big story.
And I have to note, Nick, after over 20 years being involved as a trader and a broker in the metals markets, that the price of copper, the 3-month forward contract has just gone through $10,000 a ton for the first time ever. It was about $3,000 a ton when I retired from doing it. But the spot price, the price if you want copper tomorrow, is over $11,000 a ton. And that just screams shortage. And of course, if we're going to be building electric cars, heat pumps for 27 million houses, or whatever Boris is planning for us, copper is still the main conductor. So, a rising price of... I know we all look at oil as being the great sort of inflationary measure, but don't forget copper, because it's in pretty much everything we need in the modern world.
It would be the ultimate irony if, with this electrification of everything, we end up with the 1970s story, but focused on the metals, on copper instead of oil. It would be...
Well, yeah, and of course, Nick, there's lithium and all the other things that we now need in real huge amounts, of course, to build car batteries and all the rest of it. But there's nothing in your kitchen or in your home that works that hasn't got some degree of copper in it. So I think it's something we should put on our watch list as we have these conversations.
Yeah, they say history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme, and this may be a good example of that. Let's move on to the big story, which is this issue of whether there's going to be another lockdown or lockdown light over the winter. They've gone to Plan C, I noticed today, from A and B. You've said in the past that you will not be complying with any further lockdowns. So what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think what's interesting is we've got the British Medical Association this morning saying, the government have blown it. We should be going into Plan B. Plan B, of course, is mandatory wearing of face masks, mandatory carrying of COVID passports, and a list of other restrictions. Look, the virus is spreading very, very fast, particularly in the sort of 8 to 18 age bracket. It's going around the schools like crazy. And of course, the problem with that is that they can then spread it to their parents, grandparents, or whoever it is. So we have 50,000 cases a day. Hospitalizations are up. Deaths are up a bit, although still, if we're honest about it, 10,500 people a week die of something. And at the moment, maybe 1,000 a week are dying with COVID in some form. So let's not underestimate it. We've also, of course, got the prospect of winter flu, which didn't happen last year. And it's this familiar cry, we must protect the NHS. Well, I'm really sorry, but people have been paying taxes since the late 1940s for the NHS to protect us. It's all slightly the wrong way around. The government are caught in this. Whatever criticisms I've had of the government, the truth is we've actually had one of the more liberal regimes across the Western world compared to the madness of Australia or New Zealand or many other places. The government are loath to follow what the BMA want, and I'll tell you why. Because their behavioural psychologists know there are lots of people now like me saying, look, we did obey, we will pretty much obey the first series of lockdowns, but we've reached a point now, nearly 2 years on, where we just can't go on living like this, where life has to go on. And I think if they did try to go for a full lockdown, I think the millions that would simply stick two fingers up and say, we're not doing this, is enormous. So this is not an easy position for the government. What I do expect to see are more restrictions. I'd be very surprised if nightclubs were still open in 6 or 8 weeks' time. I'd be very surprised if some form of vaccine passport didn't start to get demanded more regularly. By the way, if I'm going to a football match, I don't mind having a test that morning to prove that I'm negative, but I do mind having to carry a vaccine passport when I walk into a pub. I will not do that. And I think there's a lot of people feel like me. So it's a tough one. I think my prediction, Nick, is that we get more restrictions, but my big prediction is, and COVID's part of this, we're in for a massive health crisis. It's going to last for many, many years to come. This NHS that Boris Johnson tells us is the envy of the world, it isn't. It isn't. And that's not to demean in any way the men and women that do their damnedest and work within it, but it's not fit for purpose with a country whose population has risen as fast as ours is. So I think health is going to be a massive concern over the course of this winter, and you'll see more and more people opting out and going private if they can possibly afford to. And I think the cost of living, and I think those two things will dominate British politics over the course of the next 6 months.
It seems to me there's a bit of a transition underway where the politicians are starting to diverge from the medical experts because they're starting to understand the sorts of issues that you've raised, where compliance with an order is an entirely different matter to what the order is. Let's turn and tread very softly to the issue of vaccines. It seems to me that politicians are willing to disrupt the economy significantly in order to push vaccines, especially in parts of Europe, but also, like you mentioned, in Australia. And I think there's going to be some economic consequences from that. How do you see that playing out in first of all, the economy, but also in terms of politics? Because, we've got this winter of discontent, this energy crisis, this supply chain crisis, and yet we've got politicians being willing to do damage to the economy in order to push vaccines. How's that going to balance out in terms of the political situation and the economics?
Look, I think on the vaccines, clearly there is an active minority who are deeply suspicious of vaccines. But there's a fairly big overwhelming majority that think for most people they do make sense. Now, you can look at that another way. You could say, well, 2/3 of people who are dying in Britain at the moment have been vaccinated. That is true. That is true. Not something, by the way, that's being advertised very widely, but it is true. But then if you counterbalance that, Nick, with the fact that 86% of adults have had the vaccine, maybe that figure then is not all that surprising. The push, the big push now is for booster vaccines. And we were basically being threatened yesterday. We were being told by Sajid Javid that get the booster or you'll lose your freedoms. So they're pushing this very, very hard. It's happening right across the Western world. I am not personally particularly a vaccine rebel, but there is a danger that 10% of the population find themselves excluded from everything. And that in terms of economic activity and many other measures, it's a pretty unhealthy thing. I mean, look, it's easy to sit here and criticize everything government does. That's easy to do. But I think my own take on it is that it, on balance, is right to encourage vaccines for the adult population. But quite why 12-year-olds need it, I haven't yet made my mind up.
What about the cryptocurrency boom that is back underway? We've heard about the death of Bitcoin so many times, and I know you've stuck by it each time there's been another correction. What do you
Yeah,
make of these recent highs?
yeah. I mean, these are big moves. These are big moves. We've got Ethereum back over 4,000, Bitcoin up in the high 60s, all sorts of the other smaller speculative coins doing all sorts of strange market moves. Look, I just think that everything that comes from America, from the Fed to the big commercial payment organizations, tells you there is a wholesale legitimization of cryptocurrency that's going on. And for all the pathetic talk in this country about, the Bank of England issuing their own coin, forget it. It's all nonsense. And I think we've been. I remember last December sitting down with Sam Volkering, with all the Fortune and Freedom subscribers having access to it, and basically saying, look, it's mad not to have a small part of your investment in this stuff. And I'm very pleased we did that. I'm very, very pleased we did. Sure, it's been a bumpy, hold on hard to your seats ride. But I do think there is increasing legitimization of crypto. And look, it's America that matters. Let's just be honest about it. It's America that matters. And I also think that it is one of the hedges against inflation. And my feeling is the reason why gold is currently doing this ping pong. Gold goes down $30, rand is $25. We're in this sort of 1750, 1800 trading range in gold. It's a classic trading range that gold is in right now. And I don't for 1 minute think you're wrong about gold. I know that you believe in it very strongly. I just think at the moment, the short-term hot money is going into crypto as a hedging against inflation, as opposed to going into gold. And I think that explains a lot of what you've seen over the last few days. But look, it's wildly speculative. Bitcoin at 67,000. I mean, in a fortnight's time, it's either going to be 87 or 47. I mean, that's just the way that it is. It ain't staying here for very long, believe you me.
You mentioned Sam Volkering there. A few weeks ago, Sam and I had a bit of a good-natured debate because we both believe in cryptocurrencies and gold. But we had a debate about whether this legitimization of Bitcoin that you mentioned and the legitimization of cryptocurrencies generally, whether that means that the cryptocurrency space is losing its soul. What I mean by that is that the idea of cryptocurrencies was to undermine the banking system and the government and the taxing system and to become an international currency. At least that's how I see it. But it seems to me that Wall Street has very much co-opted it and made it its own. The governments are increasingly doing so. And I just feel like the whole point was that this wouldn't happen. The best example being that I think that the Bitcoin ETF that's launched in the US is based on Bitcoin futures. So, it's an entirely artificial financialization of Bitcoin, this creation of Wall Street. And it seems to me that it's lost its soul. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, look, I remember, Nick, here's a little anecdote. I was the front face of UKIP for many, many years. We were the fringe, outsiders, fruitcakes, lunatics, nut jobs. We were called everything under the sun. And I used to joke about being the patron saint of lost causes. And I remember in 2014, the night of the European elections, and we'd won. And I said to my gang, I said, God, we've become respectable. I'm going to have to resign. I mean, this is what happens, isn't it? That challengers in all walks of life, when a challenger comes into a very dominant position, suddenly the role changes. And this is the point we're making really this morning, isn't it? That no longer can you look at Bitcoin and Ethereum as being the cowboy end of the market. They're just not anymore. They are now legitimate financial products. And the fact there is only a certain supply of them in an age when, through the pandemic, government has just artificially created money on a scale that is difficult to believe. kind of explains why that process has happened. So yes, some of the romance is out of it. Respectability does that.